I'm Greg Prince, and welcome to Gospel Tangents.
Is it true that President John Taylor had a revelation in 1886 proclaiming that polygamy is an eternal principle? Polygamist Mormons think so. In this episode, I'd like to introduce Anne Wilde. She's a fundamentalist polygamist herself and is one of the biggest experts on modern-day polygamy that I know of. I'm really excited to talk to her. We'll ask her about the split between the LDS Church and mainstream polygamists in this day. We'll also ask her if she thinks that the current LDS Church is in apostasy. Check out our conversation. But before you do that, I just want to point out that we have our newest episode is in print now, Shannon Flynn, an inside look at Mark Hoffman. So I hope you'll go to Amazon.com. The print version is $12. You can also get it on your Kindle for just $9. So please check it out. It's a really interesting conversation. I think you'll really learn a lot about Mark Hoffman. Now back to our conversation. Welcome to Gospel Tangents podcast. I'm here with Anne Wilde. Anne is a fundamentalist Mormon, and I would say is probably one of the biggest experts on polygamy, modern day polygamy, that I know at least. Is there anybody else that knows more than you?
It's just because I'm so old. I've been around and experienced a lot of it for many years.
Well, great. So anyway, this has been funny. I've recently interviewed Brian Hales about his books on Joseph Smith's polygamy. I interviewed a member of the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he believes Joseph was a monogamist, and now you. So we're definitely talking a lot about polygamy lately.
Covering the bases.
Yes. So getting a lot of different perspectives, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. So what I wanted to start talking about is kind of how kind of the rift occurred between I'll call it Utah Mormonism and the Saints in Salt Lake. We kind of know that there was a split back in 1860 with the LDS Church. And so I'd kind of like to get into when the split occurred, kind of with the more modern, fundamentalist polygamists. So I was wondering if you could kind of give us a little bit of a history on how that started. I know there's been and I don't know if disputed is the right term, with John Taylor. Is that a good place to start, or should we start before that?
Well, I guess that's probably a good beginning, is 1886, when John Taylor claimed, and I believe, he received the revelation from the Lord regarding polygamy, because at that time it was very controversial. The law was very much involved. They were coming out here and arresting polygamists. And he was approached about signing a manifesto of some sort in 1886 in order to get kind of the government off our back, so to speak. And in the process, he received this revelation. It's only a one-page, relatively short, but it said in there that the Lord would not change an eternal principle or an everlasting covenant. And it said that after he received that, he felt like he could not sign any kind of a compromise. He said he would rather have his arm cut off or his tongue torn out rather than sign any kind of a compromise regarding doing away with plural marriage. So I guess it's kind of started then, but when they issued the manifesto in 1890, that was a key part of the whole history. 1904 was the second manifesto with Joseph F. Smith. That put a few more teeth in it than doing away with it. And then, of course, in the 1930s, Heber J. Grant issued what we call the Third Manifesto, and that really that was kind of the final straw as far as polygamists were concerned, because if they were found out to be living it, then they were excommunicated from the church. So with each succeeding manifesto, the teeth got a little stronger against us. So in the 1930s, well, it was really sooner than that, you have the Lauren Woolley story, where he felt like that he should continue plural marriage. He called a group of 7 men, including himself, that were commissioned to keep plural marriage alive, and which he did, and then gradually, one by one, they began dying off. There was Lauren Woolley, then Joseph Broadbent, who was only president of that council or senior member for about 6 months, then John Y. Barlow, then Joseph Musser. and then there were 3 others after that. But during the period of time of Joseph Musser is when a lot of the men, and some of the women for a short time, ended up going to jail. They were arrested for plural marriage or cohabitation. So during Joseph Musser's time, they went to prison. There were 15 of them specifically on this one occasion, where they disagreed on whether or not they should sign a compromise or any kind of a document in order to get out of prison to go back to their families. 11 of them ended up signing, and 4 of them did not. And that's a whole another story in itself.
Okay. Well, let's back up a little bit. I want to go back to 1886, because you said that some people were pressuring John Taylor, president of the church at the time, right, about issuing a manifesto. So who were some of these people? Were they government officials or LDS officials?
Oh, I think they were. Some of them were leaders of the church. Okay. And I couldn't say names without going back through history, but I know that the people were very leery about being arrested and being separated from their families. And so they thought if John Taylor were to sign something, it would help them not have that fear and run the risk of being arrested for having more than one wife. But when he refused to do that, he was, I think, really speaking for the priesthood of the church. But it was also, he's speaking for the church too, because it being president, he spoke for the church. But by not signing anything, that left the people that didn't want to live it kind of high and dry, so to speak, because they were at risk then of being arrested.
Okay, so I've heard that, and I don't know how true this is, so you can tell me if this is a true story or not, but I have heard that some people did not want Wilford Woodruff to be the next prophet because they were concerned that he would sign a manifesto, or a similar one that John Taylor refused. Have you heard that story before? Or?
I really haven't. I don't think when Wilford Woodruff became president of the church, he had in mind that he was going to sign a manifesto. I mean, I hadn't heard that. Let's see, John Taylor died in 1887.
This was about a year before his death that he received this revelation?
Yeah, right.
Do you think he entertained doing a manifesto prior, in 1886, prior to this revelation?
He was in hiding for he was president of the church for 10 years. 5 of those years at least, he was in hiding. And it was for plural marriage, because he had more than one wife. And he continued taking them, by the way.
Even while he was in hiding?
Yes, yeah, he did.
Oh.
Let's see, back to where, I have never heard that Wilford Woodruff was intending to sign a manifesto before he became president of the church. If that's a story you've heard, I'm not aware of it.
Well, it's not that I heard
because he even prayed about it after he became president as to what course should he take. And he was shown in a dream or told there were 2 courses. He could sign the manifesto, a manifesto, and get the government off their back, or he could, the way it was worded is, let the Lord fight their battles. Well, naturally he chose, not naturally, but he did choose what he thought was the best course for the church itself. And so he decided to issue the manifesto, so that, it's pretty hard to see a lot of the stalwart members of the church, the priesthood bearers and so forth, end up behind bars, where, they were having a tough time financially. I mean, the valley was still, 40 years old or something. They're still trying to make a living and provide for a family, and usually it's 3 or 4 wives. So to have the breadwinner, major breadwinner, in jail, that was pretty hard on the family and on the economy of the church. And I can understand that. And a lot of fundamentalist Mormons are very critical of Wilford Woodruff for signing that manifesto. In my personal understanding of it, I feel like he did what he thought was best for the church, but I think he knew that it was a priesthood law and that it could be lived by those that wanted to continue living it as a priesthood law, but they would risk their membership in the church by so doing. So I'm not as critical of Wilford Woodruff and his signing that as maybe some people are. I feel like, I really feel like he was doing what he thought was best for the members of the church, because by far most of them didn't want to live it. And so why should you enforce something that the majority of your followers don't even want to live? Common sense say, well, you're trying to do what the majority wants.
That's interesting. So, as far as this revelation, I know it seems like in the LDS Church, some people have disputed the authenticity of it. How do we know that that's an authentic revelation?
Well, because there's a copy of it in John Taylor's handwriting. That's the main authenticity I can show. Okay. I have a photocopy of that was in his writing. It fits. Another thing, a lot of times history, if it fits, and if it doesn't, you put it on a shelf for a while. To me, the whole historical background of the 1886 revelation fits, because somewhere there needed to be something to instill a desire and be the motivating factor for people to keep on living it. Without that, it would have been, I think, a lot more difficult, confusing. The Lord he'd made his voice very clear on it in section 132 and previously, but I think he needed to reiterate that to give the saints the motivation and the courage to continue with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's in his handwriting. When I don't believe that revelation is public, or is it?
Oh, anybody can find it by looking it up. I don't know
Just
if it's
online.
I would imagine it is online. Okay. I have a copy of it right here.
Okay, I might have to get a copy of that. But I'll have to post that with the interview.
Yeah, it's very much available. It's been printed in books. So I was one of Ogden Kraut's wives, and it's been in some of his books, some of Brian Hale's books, an actual copy of it. So there's all kinds of evidence for it.
Okay. When has I just talked with Kurt Bench as well. Right. You used to work, or I guess you still kind of work with Benchmark a little bit. You're emeritus, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
So, in fact, I just saw you at one of the signings for the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Uh-huh.
That's where we arranged this interview. So, the thought, especially with Kurt Bench, comes on my mind. Well, is this a Hoffman forgery? So, how long has that been known about publicly? I would assume it dates well before Mark Hoffman.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Ogden started writing books in 1969, and we knew about it then. I think anybody that really wanted to find it could find it. And fundamentalist Mormons, since a lot of their history goes back to that important revelation, they knew about it.
Okay, so is that in LDS Church archives, or where is?
Oh, I'm sure it's up there somewhere. Okay. It might not be real easy to obtain because the church doesn't like to come out and make a big deal of it. But fundamentalist Mormons make a big deal of it.
So as I understand it, John Taylor back in 1886 or so was concerned that the church may one day get rid of polygamy, and so he ordained a small subset of
the council that I mentioned before, of 7 men that were commissioned to keep plural marriage alive.
Okay, so and these 7 men were supposed to keep it alive even outside of the church if necessary. Is that?
Well, I don't know if it made that specifically clear. Even if it was outside the church, they were just commissioned to keep it alive, to see that not a year passed that a child was not born in plural marriage. At that time, they didn't, I don't think, anticipate a manifesto in 1890. They probably thought that the church was eventually going to have to compromise in some way because the pressure was getting so strong from the government. So this was an avenue that they could do it separate from the church, like I mentioned before, as a priesthood law. The thing is, with plural marriage, it was a priesthood law to begin with. When Joseph Smith reinstituted it as a doctrine that came from the Old Testament originally, it was not a law of the church. He lived it secretly for many years. He appointed others to live it. It was not a law of the church until 1852, when they came out here to the Valley and Brigham Young, brought it up. So it was a law of the priesthood, then it became a law of the church in 1852 until 1890, and then it was no longer a law of the church, but it was still a law of the priesthood. It was never not a law of the priesthood.
Well, now that's interesting.
That's how it's continued.
So, is it true that fundamentalist polygamist Mormons believe that essentially now we're living, not we, because I'm not a polygamist, that's for sure, but that the fundamentalist polygamists are living kind of in the same mode that from, I don't know where you date the beginnings of polygamy, up to 1852?
Well, it's similar.
Very similar.
Yeah, but I guess regarding whether it's a law of the church or the law of the priesthood, that part's similar.
Okay. So, yeah, I know, in fact, we just had a discussion about this, an online discussion. I know Brian Hales brought up the point that, well, you know, if you're not part of the church, we don't recognize that priesthood.
I know, that's the stand of the church today.
Right.
If you are not a member of the LDS Church, you do not have that priesthood. I disagree with that because the priesthood existed before the church was organized. I mean, they got the Aaronic priesthood before 1830, so it can and has existed separate from the LDS Church. The only way that a man can lose priesthood is not, I don't think, through excommunication from the church, unless it was from sin. That's the way a man can lose a priesthood. If he has had it conferred correctly to begin with, and he has not done anything that the Lord would not honor, then he can still hold the priesthood outside the church. The church is a vehicle through which the priesthood can function. But if the church is taking another course than the eternal principles that the priesthood is supposed to uphold, then which path do you take? That's the decision we've had to make. Are we going to abide by the eternal, unchangeable principles of the gospel and the priesthood, or are we going to go along with the church who has changed literally every doctrine and ordinance of the gospel in some way? So that's the choice.
Okay, so I guess that brings up another question then. Do you consider the current LDS Church in apostasy?
Well, the DNC says, and I will set the house of God in order. Well, it has to be out of order before it can be in order, set in order. So yes, I think to some, and people will disagree on to what level it needs to be set in order, but yes, I think the time will come. Even the Lord said, I will send one mighty and strong to set in order the inheritance of the saints and set in order the kingdom or the house of God. House meaning kingdom. So, and the church is part of the kingdom. So yes, I do believe that things will reach a point where things have to be set in order.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Anne Wilde. In our next conversation, we'll talk about post-manifesto polygamy. Is it true that Wilford Woodruff had a polygamist wife after 1890, or did the apostles do such things?
Oh, I don't know what was in the back of Wilford Woodruff's mind. I don't know, other than the fact that he took, as far as we know, there's pretty good evidence that he took a plural wife 7 years after the manifesto himself. We also have very good evidence that many of the apostles, the Quorum of the 12, took additional wives after 1890. That's one reason why the 1904 manifesto had to come out, is to put teeth in it, because so many people were very quietly taking additional wives, especially in Canada and Mexico.
Click here to subscribe, click here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some other videos that we've done here on YouTube. We hope you'll use this as a valuable resource to learn more about Mormon history.